Hey there, it's Andrea, and welcome to the Voice of Influence podcast. Today I have with me Lori Poland. Lori is a childhood survivor of a high profile child abuse case and has since devoted her life and career to ending child abuse and neglect, as well as healing its cycles and ripple effects. She has spent her career working in mental health and the nonprofit sector as a therapist for children and families. And Lori transitioned from therapy to assume the job of executive director for the National Foundation to End Child Abuse and Neglect, leveraging her background in business management and program development. Lori is also the author of the book I Live Here, a memoir, and she travels nationally as a motivational speaker, talking about possibilities after trauma, becoming a transcender, and the ripple effects of trauma on children and families. Lori, welcome to the Voice of Influence podcast.
Thank you.
Would you mind starting with just telling us a little bit about EndCAN? How kind of it got started? You guys have an interesting origin story, and then just your basic vision for the organization.
Yeah. The interesting thing that I've learned about being a business owner and running businesses is that there's a lot of fluidity required and flexibility. And so I think that what Dr. Krugman and I envisioned back when we started in 2018 and what it's evolved into are a little bit different. And I was just on a trip with our board chair and one of our board members on Sunday and Monday this week, and we were talking about the evolution and just the constant change that's required of being a business owner in general. And from the very beginning, I've strongly attempted to not run EndCAN as a nonprofit, but more so as a business.
Hmm.
I think that the mindset for us has been really the mindset in the nonprofit sector is really different and has very much of like a dependency. A nonprofit truly depends on society to help it become. And so whereas a business is really an opportunity to give back to society and like they have a product. And so the product that I would say the EndCAN has from its origin is one of hope and possibility, and really providing a space and community for people who have been impacted by this topic, as well as their friends and family. So one thing that we've come to learn is that pretty much everybody was once a child, and all of those people grew up with a story. And every one of our stories fuels and informs who we are as adults. And for some people, the stories are harder than others. And so just creating a space for the story, it's really a first things first for us. And so essentially EndCAN is a place to inform, educate, support, empower, and unite people who are interested in living in healthy and happy lives and ultimately ending child abuse and neglect.
And how do you do that?
Yeah, so I would say our biggest priority is creating community. So we have a podcast, we have newsletters that go out regularly, we have events that we host regularly, and we bring people together. So we bring people in the field of child abuse and neglect who really focus on providing direct services. We bring them together. And then in addition to that, we bring the general public together. Ultimately, the focus is to shift the conversation about child abuse and neglect from being one that only happens to certain people and is really a comparative story. So, when people hear my story is like every parent's worst nightmare. It certainly has been my worst nightmare that has like lived with me my whole life. But in addition to that, it is something that a lot of people are like, oh, well, because I didn't have that happen, my story must not be as X, Y, or Z. It must not be as big. It must not be as impactful. I must not be a survivor. I must not be, whatever, right? Fill in the blank. And as human beings, we do that. We compare ourselves to others, and that allows us to categorize our comfort level. It creates community. And so we've learned that through our time at EndCAN, recognizing this differentiation. And that differentiation has led to beautiful experiences for the field to provide direct services to populations of people that really do need it. And there is a mass, the majority of people, I would say upwards of close to 70% of our population, that has some traumatic experience in their lives that informs who they are as adults. And no child, no adult, nobody deserves what we often go through. And so it's not necessarily like blaming anybody or being mad at anybody. It's just acknowledging that you didn't deserve that story. And I'm sorry that that did happen. And we have a community where it's safe for you to be a part of that.
Hmm.
And so that's what we've been doing, is just bringing people together, and we fund grants out into the community for research, prevention, education, and training. And then we've been doing a lot of advocating, not necessarily as much policy change. We haven't, I mean, that takes a lot of millions of dollars, and we're not there yet. And we will be, I have no doubt. So, yeah.
Mm. So many things that you guys are doing, and obviously this is a big goal to end child abuse and neglect. I wonder if you would tell us some of your story.
Mhm.
Why, Lori, are you interested in this topic, but also just your background? Yeah.
Yeah, so my the first part of my story is that in 1983 I was abducted from my front yard by a stranger who asked if I liked candy. And he took me up to the mountains, and after abusing me, dropped me 15 feet below ground in the pit of an outhouse toilet in hopes that I would not be found and or survive. And needless to say, there were other plans for me, and bird watchers found me 4 days later crying. When they looked down, they asked what I was doing in a toilet, and I said, I live here. And I think that that for me is, the first example of how, as humans, we just adapt. And we've put a fancy word of resilience on that, I would say more recently since COVID, but I just find that humans are just adaptable. And so for me, that was my new normal, was being in a toilet. The second part of my story began when I was returned home. And in 1983, there were no support systems or services in place for families of abuse survivors like that. And one could imagine that, my brother, who witnessed me getting in the car, had his own trauma. And then as a mom, I could only imagine the trauma that my parents endured, my grandparents, my aunts, my uncles, my cousins, our neighbors, all the people that happened to be outside when I got taken, our community, the news media, the lawyers, like all of these people that I've met over the years, from the first responders to the 19-year-old volunteer firefighter, I mean, you name it, the 911 operator, every single person that I've come to know as an adult was impacted and changed by their experience of what happened to me. So I've never had my story of my kidnapping be mine. It's always been a shared trauma, and that's okay. It's just been an added layer of difference. And then the third part of my story has been knowing and recognizing from around the age of 8 that I was emotionally responsible for the impact and trauma of my family. And I've carried their pain and their well-being and the responsibility of their well-being up until now. And so when I was 15, I started speaking, which I would say is the fourth part of my story. I started speaking out because I realized that, well, I didn't realize, I knew very early that I had this survivor's guilt and I couldn't have an experience like what I went through and just like, become a banker. I had to do something with it. I felt like my mission in life was not of mine. And so I started speaking at 15, and I've been a speaker ever since. Most are good, and some are raw, and some are not good. And that speaking out led to, I had to do it in secrecy because I did not have the support of my immediate family. And then in adulthood, I became a therapist. I am still a therapist. I still practice. I still see clients. I love that part of my life. I love watching people heal. And I also love that it's not about me. And so the fifth part of my life was kind of really coming very public with my story, which was when I started at EndCAN. And you can't be the CEO of a national organization. And well, I guess you can, but for us, a huge part of our strategy was public messaging and being on public platforms. And so I've been on a lot of national networks, and that has come at a cost. And I published a memoir that I thought would explain my heart and explain my why. And I guess in a sense, I also thought it would help my family to understand me a little bit better and like understand what I went through. But the aftermath of publishing my book has been really awful. And, it's a whole new layer of abuse. Sometimes I'm just tired and it feels really lonely. But it's a huge reason why I do the work I do, because I said to my staff at least 8 times in the last 4 weeks that I don't wish what I'm going through on any survivor. And if this is the outcome of a survivor finding their voice, I don't want them to share their voice. I just want them to stand with us. So if I have to be the one at the front, leading the way and being the example, I will sacrifice to do that.
The impact of your abduction and abuse at the very beginning, I know was heightened and compounded by additional trauma and experiences as you continued to move along your path of life. And I wonder, have there been times when you are like, you know what, I need to pull back?
Yeah, I mean, all the time. One thing that I know about child abuse is that the perpetrators count on the silence of the victim. And for so long, that is what led me to challenge all the victims. Speak out, use your voice, stand with me, talk with me. And just this last year, I don't want them to have to do that, but it's too late for me. Like, my story has been public since it happened. I've never had the opportunity to have it private. So, it doesn't get to be. And the perpetrator counts on that. And I'm not trying to say that the hurt people are all perpetrators, but I am trying to say that every perpetrator was first hurt. And their anger is what fuels my love.
It's a heavy burden to carry.
It
I
is.
I from your book, you mentioned that at 9 years old, your abductor was released early from prison for good
Mhm.
behavior,
Yeah. Mhm.
and this sparked memories, bringing the whole event back up for you and your family, and just the reaction of kids in your class at school and stuff. Oh,
Yeah.
it's just so heartbreaking to hear that you were made fun of for your
Yeah.
experience.
Yeah.
In your book, you talk about fearing your perpetrator. You go from fearing him, like, will he come and hurt me again, to kind of learning more about him, to really cognitively empathizing with him, to actually even wanting to meet him.
Mhm.
How do you see this evolution of your experience and your understanding of the abuser in your life, and that one in particular? How do you see this evolution impacting your own personal growth, your own healing, if you will?
Really, the journey hasn't been so much about them as it is about what it releases from me.
Mm,
So, one of my favorite authors and speakers and people is Louise Hay, who passed away this last couple of years. I can't remember if it was 21 or 22, but she was just a profound woman who really emphasized that when we hold on to things, we experience the emotional impact in a physical way. And so, anger, which I have definitely danced with, like it's been braided into my world more so from probably around 27 to now. But anger is unhealthy for me. It's not unhealthy for everyone, but it's certainly not a sensation that my body responds well to. And so, me releasing the anger by way of gaining understanding about what is causing my anger has led me to not hold that. And so, my desire to create a knowing of this man that hurt me wasn't so much inquisitively wanting to be friends or wanting to understand what made him tick. It was more about wanting to not feel fear or wanting to not hide or wanting to not believe that people are capable of just doing horrible things like that. That every person ever that causes harm, there's a reason, there's a background, there's a why, there's a story. And I just find that what I need is empathy and love and kindness and acceptance and unconditional positive regard. And most important thing I need is unconditional love. I don't want anybody to feel what I have felt. And so that's what really fuels that transition for me.
so when somebody else comes to you with their story of abuse, which I'm sure happens a lot,
Oh,
what do you want to convey to them with your words, your presence?
yeah. My first, what I hope I convey, granted, you know, catch me at different times, you'll probably get a different response. But what I really hope that I convey is the same message through EndCAN that I try and live, my everyday life, which is complete acceptance, belief. Even I had this client once who his dad had abused him, and the dad denied, 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 denied. And there was no like physical evidence. And so then it was just a child's word versus parent's word. And my job was to remend attachment, whatever level it was going to be. And the dad was so angry. And my whole focus with him was that you don't have to agree. You just have to know that that is his version. And so what he knows to be true is his truth. And I think in my book, I tried to do that. And whenever I hear anybody tell me what they are experiencing, I try just to let that be their story. Even if they're like, and then the dinosaurs came and they had little arms, but they bit me with their, like, I mean, if the story is so weird that it doesn't even make sense, that's okay because it's that person's story. And, when we live in this, if you don't agree with me, then you're bad. And I'm going to publicly out you or shame you or hurt you. We've lived in that space now as a world for probably, I would say, like the last 8 to 10 years. And the damage that that is causing and the division that that is causing is so harmful. And so I hope that I'm a safe place for people just to feel unconditional positive regard and acceptance. I don't need to believe it to know that it's their truth. It's just their truth. So that's what I try and convey. And I hope that EndCAN does the same. That's community we want to inspire.
Do you have, when you think of the terminology, being a survivor, being a victim, how do these two words hit with you? What do what do you recommend when we're talking about those two words?
Yeah, so I don't know that EndCAN has necessarily adopted a language around the acceptance or denial of those words, but what I do know is that culturally, it is really hard for people to say, I'm a victim. I think we've just created such a negative connotation for that. And, the way that our system is designed to protect and treat victims is first you have to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that you are a victim and not the perpetrator who has to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that they are innocent.
Yeah.
Right. And so that's the way that our victim protection has designed. And therefore we have to have victim advocates to like stand up for and use, I don't know. It's just wild to me. And though I do write about this in my book, and I kind of talk about in my professional language as a clinician, I understand that the developmental process of healing, and that when you first go through any sort of harm, whether it's violence or gun violence or domestic abuse or, even a hurricane or something, like you're a victim to the circumstance. And there's nothing bad about that. Like you are a victim to that
You didn't do
situation.
anything to
You are
Sure.
helpless. Yeah. And
A
so that's
3-year-old saying, "Sure, I want candy," is not anything other than a victim.
right. Right. And like, like plain and simple, right? Just starting there. And so I recognize that you're first a victim and then you move through that victimhood. And for a lot of people, that's through in the way of our world right now, that's through the court system. And when you've moved through the court system and or you've moved out of your home or out of the abusive environment, or like it just kind of moved beyond the state of experience in which you were enduring being the victim, once you've moved beyond that, you become the survivor. Like you've survived that phase. Now you're over here like surviving it. Now what are we going to do with it? And then developmentally, transition into whether you become a thriver or a struggler. And a struggler is one who hasn't had the supportive needs met that would allow them to advance from that experience. And so, we see that often where people have mental breaks, they have physical breaks, they have psychotic breaks, they have addictions, versus a thriver would be somebody that then, okay, now I'm gonna find a job, I'm gonna work at the car wash, I'm gonna go to school, I'm gonna do whatever, I'm gonna keep on thriving. In infant mental health, we call it failure to thrive. Is like a baby that doesn't grow, like literally stops growing. And it's because they don't have the necessary tools to help them grow. It's like just that simple. And those necessary tools typically most often come from external forces
Yeah.
and or a medical issue. So then you need intervention to help them thrive. And so essentially in that survivorship, you need intervention. And then that could just be like a daily hug. It could be a sticker on the mirror. It could be self-talk. It could be meditation. It could be going to school. It could be therapy. It could be whatever. There's external supports that help you weave in instead of all encompassing that victimhood. And then in my language, and that I do not take any credit for this, a colleague of mine who is also a clinician and taught me everything I know about infant mental health and early childhood attachment, she said to me in probably 2006, she said, "Lori, I am just in awe that you are a transcender." And I laughed at her. I was like, "What is that?" She was like, "It's somebody that takes their experience and then uses it for the greater good." And as a Care Bear lover, I look at that as like a Care Bear stare. We're like chest out, beaming light. What's my superpower? And shine that out into the world to make the world better. And not everybody makes it to the thriving phase, and not everybody makes it past the victim phase, and not everybody makes it to transcending, and that's totally okay. You're still accepted and loved unconditionally.
And I'm sure there's a little bit of back and forth too. I mean, you
Oh,
can't possibly, I'm not always thriving, goodness.
right, let alone transcending. Yeah,
Right.
absolutely, without a doubt. So developmentally, that's kind of the process by which I understand healing, and I try and explain it and translate it to the greater world.
I think that's really helpful. You know, the response that victims often get when they come back, when they try to move on with their lives but can't, but are expected to.
Yeah.
This is really difficult. Yours isn't the only story that I've heard. I've heard so many stories of people that have experienced that, and first responders not being trauma informed, judges, lawyers, they
Yeah.
just don't even know. When you were taken to the ER after being found, you say in your book that the ER doctor didn't think that you had been abused. You've had multiple experiences like that where people who didn't understand just did not respond in ways that were helpful.
Ah,
You
yeah.
responded in ways that were very unhelpful.
Incredibly.
Yeah.
Yeah. Just that fact alone. I mean, first of all, my kidnapper pled guilty to rape, kidnapping, and attempted murder. And he had been charged and convicted prior to me. And his only interest in spending however long he spent with me, I don't know, was not at all just to like hang out and play cards. Like, we all know that. Let's just be real. What matters is that the most grotesque thing happened to a child that happened to be me. And I was robbed from my security and my comfort and the safety of my home. And I was taken from that environment and placed in a cold, smelly, dark hole for 4 days without the love and care of the people that should have been providing that for me. That's not their fault. They couldn't. They like actually could not provide that for me. So,
But that
and
was your experience.
yeah, and that changes a person. All I'm trying to do is tell other survivors, other people with stories, that their stories matter. And that it's what we do with our stories that matters more than what we've been through. And so that's what I wake up every day and I do at EndCAN. And it's why I came to see you. And it's, to get focused, to get clear, and to get deliberate and intentional about what I'm doing and why I'm doing it, and then how I'm going to do that. So that if anything, just even like an 0.18% of the harm is less caused. Like, that's all really I need is just a little less harm caused.
Hmm.
That'd be really, really cool.
I know that this idea of like, if people are more educated, maybe they'll respond differently to these kids. Maybe the kids will
Yeah.
hurt a little less. Start putting a block in that
Yeah.
cycle.
Whatever age, like if we have a little bit of intervention on the whole lifespan,
Yeah.
in 15 years, our kids are going to be saying, absolutely not, you can't do that. If you do that, I'm telling, instead of if you tell, I'll do this, right? Like it shifts the power. And we have seen an uptick in middle schoolers calling in and asking for help.
Mm.
They have video, they have evidence, they have pictures, like the ability for a younger child, or a younger adult, I guess, a preteen, the ability for them to use their voice now versus 20 years ago has gone up significantly. That means we're doing some things right.
Mm.
And I just want to keep expanding that, not because I want, to prosecute every harmer. I think that would inundate our systems, and it just won't even be possible when we've got thousands of years of history of people harming others. But instead, to reduce the percentage, to create more love and acceptance, and helping people to feel empowered to protect themselves.
We are all human. We all have these hidden needs. We all do to some degree. We have hidden needs. We had things that are hidden inside of us that are causing other issues in our lives. They have impact. Our personal inside psychological self, our the biochemistry, like you were talking about, these things impact the way that we do work, the way that we interact with people. And if leaders, if those of us who care would do more to be curious about those things when something's going wrong, or when somebody's upset, or when whatever, that we'd stay curious and look to connect
Mm.
instead of looking to fix
Yeah.
or change people. It's difficult because I think people don't want to have to deal with their own humanity. But if we could all get to that place where we saw it, that we all are human, and the brokenness that happens, yes, it happens to all of us. I'm so longing for people to find that connection with others instead of pushing it back on them, pushing it back on the victim, to hold their story in and not bother to disrupt the status quo. That does not do any of us any good.
Yeah.
And it's just eating people alive.
Historically, we've seen other things come more public that were expected to be silenced. I mean, even breast cancer in the 70s and 80s, if you had breast cancer, nobody knew.
Mm.
And now, like, if you have breast cancer, you put on a pink tutu and you march right down to that walk, and, you with 30 of your friends and family members, and you join millions and millions of people across the country in just being a part. And I think, man, okay, if we've done that in 40 years. And granted, people say, yeah, but health things are things that you can't really control. They're things that didn't happen to you. It's medical. I'm like, all right, well, I've never met a child who can control being abused. And I feel like the story is pretty similar. It's not quite the same, but gosh, if we could do that for breast cancer, maybe we could do this for
Hmm.
child abuse.
And like you had said earlier, there is a physical manifestation that happens
Oh yeah.
with this. So
The health
it is a
issue.
health issue.
Oh,
And I
for sure.
know that you're trying to change the narrative around that as well. And let's treat it like it's a medical issue, because then we'll actually do something about it, which is
Yeah.
shocking that that is the truth, but it is the truth. Lori, thank you for sharing your story. Would you mind sharing where people can find EndCAN and you? Because I know that you're a
Yeah.
speaker as well.
Yeah. Yeah. Our website is EndCAN, ENDCAN.org. And you can reach me through there. I have a wonderful, wonderful staff of guardians and advocates and professionals that are in it to do great big things. And I'm just so grateful for them. And they will help connect people who are seeking or wanting to connect with me to me.
One last question that I always ask. We emphasize healthy influence. So, what last piece of advice do you have for somebody that wants to be or have a voice of influence?
Well, I would say that I have yet to meet a person who doesn't just want to matter. And so I would first start with saying that every one of us matters. And it's not what we've been through, it's what we do with what we've been through that can create the influence necessary. And just our actions can be our voice, just our presence can be our voice, just our nodding of our heads can be our voice, just our hug can be our voice. It doesn't require any of us to share or not share. It just is an invitation to use our stories gracefully, intentionally, and with love to be the change that I think we all are eager to see in this world.
Thank you, Lori.